As human levels of technology have increased, we have gone from the idea of spontaneous generation to kind of just bad blood being the root of all causes, or like demons or something, and all of these plague humanity, to a fundamental understanding that there are creatures we cannot see with our own eyes that can invade our bodies, causing us to become greatly ill or even drop us as a result. Because of this, humans for a very long time have hoped something would come along that would break us of this mortality rate. As our methods became more sophisticated, this led to a breakthrough in an understanding of viruses specifically. The first major instance of this, when it was noted that those who contracted cowpox seemed to not be able to contract smallpox. Inoculation with cowpox became standard, but nobody really understood what the connection was. This simply was a cause and effect at the beginning that helped us live in a world where smallpox was a major issue, but now it is no longer really a problem as we have eradicated it, except for like a few small batches in areas that the common person wouldn't really know of. After doing this, many other advancements would take place, and humanity attempted to tackle polio to great success, but due to botched batches that they kind of rushed, people ended up contracting polio in the 50s rather than staving it off. So even with science, human error can rear its ugly head. Over the last 70 years specifically, our understanding of viruses in particular has grown monumentally. No longer are they just seen as an annoyance or even deadly disease, but they can actually be used in this timeline, the world you are sitting in right now, to deliver gene-altering material to correct diseases, fight other viruses, and even fight a form of skin cancer. And this actually and interestingly ties this universe of I Am Legend to ours. During the events just before Christmas, roughly a few weeks before actually, a virus was overhauled to combat cancer, which was being hailed as a literal cure for it as well. However, this virus would have far-reaching implications for humanity and would almost bring about our extinction as a result. So in this episode, we will talk about the Dark Seers as well as the virus and why it may have done what it did, because I didn't know if you guys know this or not, but viruses are my jam. So let's get to it. But first, before I get to that, did you know I'm streaming on a regular schedule on the Purple channel? If you want to check that out during the weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern Time Zone, that would be cool with me. I'm trying to build it up, and it's been a lot of fun so far, except for The Last of Us Part 2. I really hate that game. So as per usual, I will put a timestamp up on screen if you would like to bypass the summary of the movie, if you've kind of already seen it, but if you haven't, let's do a quick rundown as to what actually happens and why we find the world in the state that it is today. At the very beginning, we hear an interview being conducted where essentially cancer has been cured. Utilizing the measles virus as a conduit for this cure, it will attack the cancer cells, infecting them, bursting them, but also making the body more aware of the cancer that is there. Everyone seems pretty jazzed about it, but it's not meant to last. Immediately, we see a deserted ruins of Manhattan and a man hunting for food with his dog Sam. It's quite apparent that this whole city is abandoned. There's no pockets of survivors, no bandits, just U.S. Army virologist Lieutenant Cole Robert Neville and other wild animals. Attempting to keep his sanity, he continues through the mundane life in this post-apocalyptic world, talking to mannequins at a store, watching recorded TV news broadcasts, the usual. During these events, we see that in his basement, he is actively working on a cure for the cancer cure that has ransacked the entire planet. Some of the lab mice appear to have had really no effect brought on by the different compounds Robert was working on. Others seem to have just completely dropped because of it, but one in particular began having a reaction. Pupillary reaction to light, less aggression, and lower temperature. Seeing that this was a potential cure, Robert called it a day and then set off to go hunt some food. Here we get a flashback of what was going on and where his family went. In an attempt to get off the island before the lockdown hit, they arrived at a group of people also trying to do the same thing. The military is scanning everyone to make sure the infected do not get off the island, and after scanning Robert and his daughter, they are cleared. However, upon scanning his wife, she is quickly deemed as infected. After Robert's guards raise their rifles to the other side, an altercation almost breaks out until Robert pulls rank and demands another rescan. After clearing her for heading to the chopper, we see in the flashback the effects of the virus is already spreading. One mother can be seen with blood coming out of her eyes as a result of her infection, and this is a sign of things to come that will be explained later. After getting on the helicopter, there is some confusion as to what's going on, and a helicopter ends up crashing. When this happens, it hits the helicopter that Robert's family was on, and they are immediately ended in the process. As Robert continues his hunt, it leads him to begin chasing a deer with Sam. The deer panics and then runs inside of a building to escape, with Sam closely following. Robert freaks out, knowing that the Dark Seers typically prefer the safety of buildings during the day. Moving into the building, we get our first quick look. Moving through the building methodically, we see him shine a flashlight on a group breathing quickly and apparently sleeping. Moving out of this area, he ends up finding Sam hiding underneath a table. He looks over and then finds that a Dark Seer is currently eating the deer that ran in. It shrieks at him and begins the attack. Taking off in a full sprint, this creature is quickly on Robert's tail. As he runs, Sam breaks off through a dog-sized hole in the wall to the outside. Robert, however, is forced to jump through a window window after being attacked, which in turn brings the creature outside. And we see that even though it is not in direct sunlight, the creature writhes in pain in the mere presence of light and then is quickly ended after just a few seconds of being outside. Robert, upon finding this group, sets up a snare trap and then gets a female in the process. If only it were that easy. Bringing her back to the basement, which is pretty messed up sentence I just typed, he begins injecting what I assume to be the cure that was based on the lab mice. It seemingly works for a moment as her core temperature starts to drop and her breathing begins to return to normal. However, after a yell, she crashes out and her heart stops. Robert injects what I imagine is adrenaline into her to get her heart restarted, or likely a compound used by paramedics to do the exact same thing, which in turn restarts her heart, and she returns back to infected status. Deeming it a failure, he stops for the night. The next day, as Robert is driving around, he notices that Fred is standing out in the open. Well, Fred is a mannequin from the video store, so what the hell is Fred actually doing out here? Completely losing his mind over it, Robert starts screaming this at Fred and asking if he's real. After having a mental break, he steps in a puddle to which the car next to him drops off and then snares his leg, knocking him unconscious as it brings him up. Coming to, as his watch alerts him that night is coming, the sun fades and a lone male who presumably set the trap for Robert with the infected dogs shows up. The sun provides some safety momentarily, keeping the dogs at bay, but eventually they get past. A fight ensues and this causes Sam to get bit in the process. After getting home, Robert injects Sam with a cure, but it appears that it's too late as she shows signs that she is turning and he is forced to choke her out, which ends the poor quadruped. Vowing revenge at this point, Robert goes to the place where he has been going to try to contact survivors. He sets up a trap to lure the Dark Seekers and waits until they run past, then attempts to ram them with his vehicle. Eventually during the attack, he is rendered unconscious and picked up by a woman and a boy and brought back to the house. When Robert fully comes to, he is told that they were from a survivor camp and he insists that no such thing exists. Back at the house, Robert adjusts the potential cure and injects the female Darkseer again. However, it becomes apparent later in the day that they didn't come back home during the late morning hours, but actually the early morning hours when the Darkseers were still watching. An attack on Robert's compound begins as he attempts to hold them off, and eventually it all culminates in the group being cornered downstairs in the lab. Behind a thick glass door, Robert notices the cure has begun working on the female and that she is returning to human. Yelling that he can save everyone falls on deaf ears, so he puts the woman and the boy in a coal chute and pulls out a grenade and rams into the alpha male that has basically been tracking him for a couple days now, which takes out everybody in the room. And then at the end, the woman and the boy go back to their survivor camp and it is a real thing. But there is an alternate ending which is way less depressing, but still kind of depressing. Upon realizing that the alpha male just wants his mate back, he apologizes and returns the female back to the Darkseer. Seeing as these creatures do actually have high intellect, the alpha male leaves with his group and Robert looks upon all the pictures of experiments that he did with remorse. He then decides to leave the area and go back to the survivors camp, seemingly giving up on trying to cure this disease. So first thing we need to cover is why did this go so horribly wrong for humanity despite the best intentions and the fact that to some degree it did actually work during the trials? Well, the human body is a fickle thing. Things that affect you may not affect me and vice versa. For example, I am a carrier of flu. Due to specific genes that I have and likely my blood type playing a role in it, when I catch a virus, I am less likely to show extreme symptoms. So I've actually never really displayed any symptoms of the flu. I mean, I get a little more tired than normal, but no fever, no body aches, no headaches, just a little tired. And this is after being tested and confirmed that I did have the flu. So I've been told though that the flu is bad, but I've just never really experienced it myself. For others, the flu can be deadly, which is why medicines like Tamiflu were invented. But the moral of this story is, it's how your body reacts to viruses, and this is largely indicated by your DNA. So assuming that the test group was utilized for this cure, known as the Krippin virus, it may have been relatively small and they needed to work with a specific blood type, and it is possible that there may have been some bias. As a result, those who were tested on had their cancer cured and it appeared to not be an issue. So as the cancer cure was implemented across the planet, it started to interact with those who did not have any specific criteria, and as a result, may have inspired different results. We know that the virus chosen to be the cancer cure was a modified form of measles, but to understand the creatures created and the lethality of it, we have to know what measles actually does. Measles is for some reason thought to be a relatively harmless disease, but the fact is it does more damage to your immune system, even if it's just a mild case, after one infection than 5 to 10 years of HIV left unchecked. We know for a fact that measles increases the chances of children dying for up to 5 years post-infection because it will absolutely annihilate your immune system's memory. Alright, so we all know why we're on this channel, and it's time for that sweet, sweet science because I absolutely love how the immune system and diseases conduct their conflicts. It's likely why I I did what I did as a scientist before becoming a YouTuber. In our bodies, our immune systems do more than just fight diseases. They remember them too. So within the immune system, there's something known as B cells, and B cells are responsible for remembering diseases as well as producing antibodies the body has fought before, and as a result, when this disease pops back up, these antibodies are quickly released, which in turn will annihilate the disease before it has any chance to get a foothold. And this is why vaccinations are important, because likely you actually have come into contact with the disease that you've been vaccinated for, but your body overcame it before you were even really noticing it or it had any profound effect. But anyhow, B cells will release these antibodies to attack invaders as they are selected for the remembering of the shape of the cellular surface receptors of this invader. And I know that was a tongue twister, but it is what it is. So when you're infected with measles, this destroys these B cells as your body basically has to go nuclear option and throws everything it has at the virus. The result is the loss of these B cells and then immature B cells needing to take their place. They have no memory of any disease that you have fought before. They also cannot as readily produce antibodies, and as a result, you could see a decreased antibody level up to 40% depending on the severity of the case. This means that your body's immune system is working at 60% capacity, and illness more readily bypasses these barriers in place, and this leads to more problems. Measles also attacks the body in general. When you are infected, you get a rash, and this is because the virus attacks the capillaries in the skin, and as a result, the cells will release histamines to attract immune cells to help clear this infection. This ultimately causes damage to the body, but in the end is more readily healed than the immune system. So taking this disease, the doctors of this universe decided to reprogram it to infect cancer cells. Using what we know, how does this work? Well, it's a two-pronged attack. As the measles infects the cancer cells utilizing receptors specific only to the cancer cell, the virus enters a cell, hijacks a cell much like it would any other, and then builds more viruses, eventually causing the cell to burst, destroying it. This also has the added effect of activating the natural killer T cells. NKT cells are responsible for finding and destroying cells infected with viruses, so as a result of the likely infection of cancer cells with the altered measles virus, NKT cells will find the cancer cells and destroy. This causes the cancer to be attacked by both viruses and the natural immune system of the body as well, because of the role of the NKT cell and how it is programmed to attack tumors regardless. So I hope you enjoyed that little bit of breakdown. Obviously, the immune system is much more complicated than that. That gives you somewhat of an idea. So this created essentially the cure for cancer known as the Krippin virus. But where it all went wrong is likely the genetic differences amongst people, and here's why. The natural infection rate of measles is said in the movie to be about 90% of the people that were infected. And this is assuming everyone was infected and then bled out on the spot. If you didn't know, measles in its most infectious form has a 90% infection rate, which perfectly adds up to the 90% infection rate in the movie. So this comes out to about 5.4 billion people who completely dropped days after the infection, and the bleeding from the mother's eyes in the flashback kind of shows this. And considering this is also a natural thing for measles to do, attack blood vessels, this is actually pretty accurate as to why it may have done this. Regardless, 9.8% of the population appears to have some resistance to the disease, but it's not good enough. After their infection, their body was able to resist the worst effects to a degree, but it inspired many changes that we will cover in a moment. But largely, they became dark seekers, a vampiric albino zombie creature cannibal who retained its intelligence somewhat, but hostility was greatly increased. And this means there's about 588 million dark seekers. Then the last 0.2% of the population were completely immune or may have just been carrier status. This left only about 12 million normal human beings who presumably became food for the dark seekers. This small group would likely have been extremely scattered and very unaware there were any survivors, much like Robert was. So why the spread of numbers amongst humans like this? Well, presumably once again, it all appears to come down to how the body reacts. We know that measles can affect blood vessels. Likely also for this cure to work, the virus was changed to bypass any previous vaccinations, meaning that a 99.8% infection rate was acceptable as a medicine. So vaccination status wasn't a factor, which again points to how the body reacts versus some outside influence. Those that were susceptible to measles like normal, now infected with this form of, I guess, super measles, had the effects happen as normal. As their blood vessels were attacked, it didn't just stick to the capillaries, but instead likely went on to the larger vessels, such as, the aorta, for instance, and began attacking everything, which led them to quickly bleed out. The eye scans were likely to look for damage to the ocular capillaries, since those were very sensitive to damage. This would show infection status quite quickly and reliably as long as you didn't have like a pre-existing condition. Those who were dark seers were sort of like middle ground. And when I say middle ground, what I mean is the virus likely still attacked their blood vessels, but considering B cell selection with a virus is random chance, these would have been, depending on how you look at it, fortunate enough to keep the virus somewhat at bay, but this appears to be a continuing battle in the body. So let's get a look at Dark Seers and see what the result is for those who remain alive but infected. The list for symptoms is quite lengthy. Externally, we see that the now infected are suffering from a form of albinism. As a result, all skin pigmentation appears to have been lost, and this loss means that UV radiation is no longer effectively absorbed by the melanin, which in turn makes them susceptible to burns quite quickly. And because of this, Dark Seers shockingly seek out the darkness. Being forced into this nocturnal lifestyle is how they stay alive, because even moments outside we see they suffer and succumb to this detrimental effect. But due to their nocturnal lifestyle and likely destruction of blood vessels within their eyes, leading to potentially issues with the retina, this has caused the pupils to remain dilated to bring in as much light as possible, which makes them even more susceptible to the light outside, inducing great pain within the eyes. And I conclude that this may be the result, as when we look at the gums on Samantha as she changes, the blood vessels almost seem to enlarge and inflame, which would cause problems with delicate tissues. Another symptom for the infected is hair loss. Hair is the result of fast-growing cells, and under times of extreme stress for the body, hair can be lost as a result. And here, we can see it's more present than ever. Internally, this person is an absolute mess. The stressors put on the body would likely decrease lifespan by a considerable amount. So first, let's talk about the actual infection. We see that this person was infected, and when they were, they undergo a lot of physical changes, but on the inside, they are more profound. The blood vessel dilation, for instance, would likely cause the brain to experience a consistent migraine-like pain. Again, this would be important to stay out of the light as a result, but due to the infection, the meninges within the skull would also swell as the body continues to fight this disease. So fighting this disease also means that the brain is somewhat in control as to what's happening, and because of this, the body temperature is roughly about 40 degrees Celsius or 104 degrees Fahrenheit, which is an extremely high fever. This constant state of infection and such a high temperature would also make them delirious. This, coupled with the meningitis, may have the added effect causing them to be more aggressive due to the added pressure on the brain of this person, which is actually cited as an issue with meningitis now. Or it can be either that or you're just kind of knocked unconscious. Basically, anything that messes with your brain has a lot of varying effects. But this heightened state of pain would also have the added benefit to release adrenaline. It is known that Dark Seers have adrenaline constantly being dumped into their system. This has given them super strength and increased senses, but it has a secondary effect of increasing demand for oxygen. And we see most Dark Seekers are hyperventilating as a result of this increased demand. So now you may be wondering about the albinism as well, and I too kind of wondered this, but it's actually pretty simple when you realize that measles has a tendency to go into the capillaries of the skin, and this causes a rash. So it's not too hard to imagine that it may be entering the skin cells at this point too, and when there, it would alter the DNA, and because of this, melanin production is affected until this creature becomes pale white as a result. Those who remained immune or just carrier status all appear to not just be infected. Whether they are or not really kind of seems irrelevant. Their bodies just do not display any of the symptoms. This may be entirely possible, believe it or not. So an example of why it might be possible is due to the Bubonic Plague a long time ago, which still exists today. Some Central Europeans are now resistant or outright immune to HIV as a result because of the mutation concerning the Delta 32 allele. The virus can no longer attach to the cell, and as a result, it cannot infect person. Now, HIV can adapt because it mutates very readily, which means it might be able to attach to other receptors, but essentially after the Bubonic Plague rolled through, the co-receptor that was above the cellular surface is now partially underneath the cellular surface, so it can't really attach that well. But again, it might be able to go with another receptor. But it's likely that the 0.2% who are immune, going back to the Krippin virus, have some sort of cellular receptor that the virus cannot attach to. Therefore, they can only be eaten and never infected. What's also interesting is that this disease has the ability to jump species. Whereas humans were susceptible to both the airborne strain and direct body fluid transfer, animals appear to only be infected by direct body fluid transfers, as when Sam was bitten by an infected dog that the alpha had, which shows why the virus was able to span across the world so quickly, because it's in the air and in the fluids. It appears that animals such as dogs may only be susceptible to fluid transfer because of the close proximity to human, which resulted in continuous exposure to the virus, which means it was able to mutate or adapt to some degree for another receptor on a cellular surface. Which, you know what that means, right? That the 0.2% likely could in the future become infected if they remain exposed for long enough. But should they keep their distance and also allow for enough time to pass, those infected would likely start dropping just from old age if they don't reproduce, because they actually can hunt, and then they can kind of retake the planet, albeit this would be a massive genetic bottleneck. But maybe one day we'll get I Am Legend 2 Electric Boogaloo, which explores this idea. But until then, I want to thank you guys for watching, leaving a like would be awesome if you enjoyed, and subbing is a great way to stay up to date on when I post. So we passed by 300,000 subs last week. I appreciate the support, guys. Guess we'll keep this thing going until we hit 1 million, shall we? I'll drop my Twitter, Discord, Twitch, Patreon, and other channel links in the description if you're interested in that. And I'd also like to thank my patrons real quick. Huge shout out to my 3 astronauts, It's Not a Spoon, Trey Windenall, and AVC. You guys are awesome, and I want to thank you for all the support you give this channel. And I would also like to thank our lone scientist, Skilt, for his stellar support as well. Thank you, man. And to the rest of my patrons, you guys are greatly appreciated. Paying back these student loans is always fun, and with your help, it's going a long way to make that possible. So thank you. All right, so that does it for me. Let me know what you guys thought down in the comments, and I will see y'all in the next one.